Kreminna Forest, Luhansk region, night of May 27, 2026. No moon. Cloud cover thick enough that even the horizon doesn't glow. 8 kilometers behind the tree line, under camouflage netting and stacked sandbags, a Russian radar sits in silence. Mud from 3 days of spring rain still clings to the tarpaulin edges. A generator idles nearby, muffled under its own sound-dampening box, because even engine noise carries in a forest this quiet. 2 soldiers rotate watch in a dugout 20 meters off, rifles slung, thermos passed between them, neither one expecting anything to happen tonight. Nothing ever happens on these nights. That's the whole point. It's a Zoopark 1M, counter-battery radar, the one piece of equipment Russian gunners trust with their lives. For months it has stayed dark on purpose. Every time it switches on, it becomes visible to anyone listening for it. So the crew inside limits each sweep to a few seconds, just long enough to catch an incoming shell in flight, never long enough to get traced back. Tonight, that discipline runs out. A Ukrainian heavy-lift octocopter, call sign Vampire, nicknamed Baba Yaga by the crews who fly it, drifts through the dark at 40 meters. Slow, almost silent. Under its frame, a shaped charge waits. The pilot isn't looking for heat, he's looking for cold. One shape in the thermal frame colder than the wet spring soil around it. A stack of unfired electronics, still hidden under netting, still radiating less warmth than the ground it sits on. He finds it. 10 seconds later, the charge is gone. So is the antenna array. And within hours, so is the hearing of 22 Russian artillery pieces that depended on it to survive. This is the story of how one slow, wooden-framed drone, worth less than a used car, erased the single most important electronic asset on its stretch of front. Not a tank, not a command post, a radar the size of a delivery truck, and the reason it mattered more than a dozen armored vehicles put together. To understand why, you have to understand what a Zoopark actually does, and why a Ukrainian crew spent close to 3 months just waiting for it to blink. The Zoopark 1M, sometimes listed under its older designation 1RL232, is what's called a counter-battery radar. NATO calls it dog ear. Its job sounds almost simple. Watch the sky for artillery shells and mortar rounds already in flight. Calculate their trajectory backward, and spit out the exact coordinates of the gun that fired them. From detection to firing solution, the whole cycle takes under a minute. Along the Kreminna axis in the spring of 2026, that one radar was feeding data to an entire Russian artillery group. 22 guns. A mix of 2 A-65 Mustabi towed howitzers and 2 S-3 Akatsiya self-propelled guns, spread through tree lines and dug positions east of the Zarabets River. Whenever Ukrainian artillery fired more than 2 rounds from the same spot, a Russian shell answered within 90 seconds, sometimes less. Crews on the Ukrainian side learned to treat their own guns like something disposable. Fire, move, because staying in one place for 3 minutes was a death sentence. The radar itself is not cheap. Manufacturer estimates and Ukrainian intelligence assessments put its value north of $10 million, with some sources citing figures closer to $14 million, once you factor in the specialized antenna array and processing suite. Russia doesn't have an unlimited supply of them. Losing one isn't like losing a truck. It's losing the ears of an entire sector. The crew hunting it belonged to a heavy drone unit, attached to Ukraine's operational grouping, covering the Kreminna direction. Their call signs, for this story, are Hrym and Sokil, Thunder and Falcon. Hrym flew. Sokil ran the mission, read the thermal data, made the call on when to commit a $14,000 airframe to a target that might not even be there anymore by the time the drone arrived. They'd known about the radar's rough position since February. Knowing roughly where something is and being able to put a shaped charge through its antenna are 2 very different problems. The first obstacle was simple physics. A radar that only transmits for 2 or 3 seconds at a time is almost impossible to fix a position on. Ukrainian direction-finding teams tried for 6 weeks using signals intelligence alone. Every time they got a bearing, the emission had already stopped. Command started asking whether the target was even worth the resources anymore. Sokil's answer, according to someone who worked alongside the unit, was that a radar you can't see is still a radar that's killing your guns. They kept watching. Then came the weather. Late March and most of April brought a fog bank that sat over the Kreminna forest for close to 3 straight weeks. Thermal optics are useless through that kind of moisture. Recon flights that would normally run every clear night got scrubbed entirely. The unit's own mission log, I went through as much of it as the crew was willing to show, has a stretch of 11 consecutive nights marked simply as no visibility, stood down. 11 nights of nothing, while the radar kept doing its job, and Ukrainian gun crews kept eating counter-battery fire on the other side of the line. One of those crews belonged to a battery position near Serebryanka Forest, manning a towed D-30 howitzer that had already been relocated 4 times that month. The gun commander, known to his crew only by the call sign Hutorianen, had lost his loader on April 6th to a counter-battery strike that landed 40 seconds after their 3rd round left the barrel. Inside the window, they thought they still had. He wasn't part of Hrim and Sokil's unit, and he never met them. But the coordinates his battery kept feeding up the chain, the timestamps of every strike that hit close enough to log, became part of the same slow, cumulative case for why that radar had to die. His loader's name doesn't appear in any official account of the Zoopark strike. It's not the kind of detail that makes it into an after-action report. It's the kind of detail that makes a unit like Hrim's refuse to give up on a target after 6 weeks of nothing. The break came from an unexpected direction. Not a satellite, not a fancier sensor. A captured Russian signals log, recovered from a position overrun near Torske in early April, that listed activation windows for radar assets across the sector. Timestamps the operators used to coordinate handoffs between units. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was a pattern, and patterns are exactly what a patient crew needs. The position at Torske fell after a short, ugly fight, a Ukrainian assault group clearing a forward observation post that had been shelling a supply road for weeks. 2 Russian soldiers survived the assault and were taken for processing. One of them, a junior signals operator with no interest in dying for a war he'd been conscripted into 8 months earlier, gave up more than his captors expected during a routine debrief. Not coordinates, he claimed not to know those, but the rhythm of it. Which units handed off radar coverage to which, on what rough schedule, and why the Zoopark crews he'd worked alongside treated their activation windows like a closely guarded secret, even from soldiers on their own side. It wasn't intelligence gold, it was texture. But texture is what turns a 6-week dead end into a plan. By the last week of April, the fog had lifted. The pattern from the captured log lined up with 3 nights of fresh thermal footage. Command approved a dedicated watch rotation. The obstacle that had eaten 6 weeks was gone. What the crew didn't know yet was that their first 2 attempts to close on the position would both end in the drone turning back empty-handed. The first attempt, April 29th, got within 2 kilometers before Hrim spotted a Tor M2 short-range air defense vehicle repositioning almost directly under the flight path. Aborting cost them the airframe's fuel margin and the whole night. The second attempt, May 9th, made it further, only for the thermal signature at the suspected radar site to turn out to be a decoy heat source, a stack of diesel drums someone had rigged to mimic exactly the kind of cold-against-warm ground anomaly they were trained to look for. Here's what's most surprising about the whole hunt, and it isn't the eventual strike. It's that a modern Russian counter-battery unit, operating a $10 million system, still relied on something as old as camouflage discipline and decoys to survive. No cyber warfare, no electronic countermeasure suite. Netting, sandbags, and a barrel of diesel arranged to look warm on a thermal camera. That's the part that should unsettle anyone who thinks this war is only being fought with satellites and algorithms. A lot of it still comes down to a guy with a thermal camera, patient enough not to fall for the trick twice. Here's the take that'll probably get us some pushback in the comments. Keeping that radar alive for as long as Russian command did wasn't caution. It was negligence dressed up as discipline. Every week the Zoopark stayed operational. More Ukrainian gun crews died to counter battery fire that radar made possible. The netting and the diesel drum decoys bought Russia 3 extra months of that radar's service life. Whether that's smart defense or a body count that should sit on someone's conscience depends on which side of the tree line you're standing on. What would you have done in Sokil's position, staring at 2 failed attempts and a commander asking if this target was still worth the fuel and the risk? Would you have pulled the unit off it and moved to something easier, or doubled down on 3 months of patient watching, because the alternative meant more Ukrainian crews dying to counter battery fire they never saw coming? The unit doubled down. May 19th brought a 3rd attempt, and this one nearly ended the whole operation early. A Ukrainian recon element supporting the mission spotted movement near the suspected radar site. Not equipment, personnel. What looked like a shift change. 3 or 4 soldiers moving between the netted position and a dugout 20 meters away. The recon drone operator, flying a separate reconnaissance quadcopter well outside audible range, counted 4 distinct heat signatures crossing the open ground in under 90 seconds. Then 2 more emerging from the dugout to replace them. A clean handoff, practiced enough to suggest it happened every night at roughly the same hour. Command debated aborting to avoid an incident that might draw a heavier response than the mission was worth. Sokil argued the shift change pattern itself was useful information. It told them exactly when the position was least guarded and most predictable. They held off the strike, but kept the drone circling wide, out of thermal detection range, cataloging the routine, logging the handoff time down to the minute across 3 separate nights before committing to anything. That routine is what put Krim in position 8 nights later, on May 27th, with a target he finally trusted. The shift change pattern held. The decoy drums stayed cold that night, exactly where they'd been the week before. What nobody on the Ukrainian side accounted for was how close the strike would come to failing anyway, because of something as simple as wind. A crosswind of roughly 18 kilometers an hour picked up over the Kreminna forest just after 23 o'clock, strong enough to push the octocopter's flight path several meters off its planned line during the final approach. Krim compensated manually, correcting heading every few seconds, watching fuel burn faster than the mission plan allowed for. There was a real chance the drone would run dry before it reached the target and have to ditch somewhere in contested ground, taking Ukraine's most successful lead on this radar down with it. Inside the command post, Sokil watched the same wind numbers scroll across a secondary display and said nothing for almost 4 minutes straight. The kind of silence that, according to someone who was in the room, meant he was doing fuel math in his head faster than the software could update it. The feed from Krim's headset crackled twice with static from the crosswind interference. Neither man spoke unless it mattered. 3 months of failed attempts had taught them both that talking on the circuit accomplished nothing the instruments couldn't already tell them. It didn't run dry. At 23:47, the Vampire crossed the final 200 meters at 40 meters altitude, throttled back until it was barely making forward progress, and Krim matched the cold rectangular shape under the netting against the thermal map he'd built over 3 months of failed attempts. This was it, the real thing, not diesel drums. The drone descended to roughly 15 meters. Sokil, watching the same feed from the command post, gave the final go. Krim released the shaped charge. 10 seconds of fall time. Then impact, straight through the antenna array. The one component on the entire vehicle that Russia cannot simply weld back together in a field workshop. The chassis, the generator, even the operator cabin can survive a lot of abuse and get patched up. The antenna is precision hardware, specialized manufacturing. Weeks to replace, not days. The feed went white for a half-second on impact, then settled into a spreading heat bloom where cold electronics had been seconds earlier. Zoopark 1M. Silent. Permanently this time. Confirmation didn't come from the strike footage alone. 3 days later, a Ukrainian analysis cell reviewing satellite imagery of the same coordinates logged a follow-up pass, showing the netted position stripped down to bare chassis, the antenna mount visibly gone, and a support vehicle parked nearby that hadn't been there before. The kind of recovery truck used to haul away equipment too damaged to repair on site. That single frame, cross-referenced against the strike timestamp, was what let command mark the target destroyed, rather than merely damaged. In this war, a drone's own camera is rarely enough on its own. Someone still has to go back and check the wreckage against a second source before anyone writes the kill down as confirmed. Here's what this tells us about how this war actually gets decided at the tactical level. It isn't the biggest weapon that wins a sector. It's whoever controls the information loop, who can see the other side's guns fire and answer fast enough to matter. Break that loop, and it doesn't matter how many howitzers are sitting behind the tree line. They're firing blind. What happened over the following 18 hours is the part Russia never put out in any statement, and the part this footage has never been shown publicly until now. Without the Zoopark's fire correction data, the 22 guns tied to that radar lost their 90-second answer window. Ukrainian artillery observers monitoring the sector reported Russian counter-battery response times stretching past 6 minutes within the first few hours, then effectively stopping altogether by the next morning. Some guns kept firing on pre-registered coordinates, blind volleys with no correction. Others simply went quiet, waiting for a replacement sensor that wouldn't reach the sector for weeks. Ukrainian howitzer crews who had spent months firing 2 rounds and relocating within 90 seconds suddenly had a window measured in minutes, not seconds. One battery commander in the sector, speaking to a Ukrainian outlet afterward without naming his unit, said his crews fired more rounds in the 18 hours after the strike than in the previous 5 days combined, because for the first time since February, they didn't have to run. Among those crews, unconfirmed but plausible given the timing, was Hutorianin's battery near Serebryanka Forest, the same D-30 crew that had lost a loader in April to a counter-battery response they never saw coming. Whether they knew the reason their return fire suddenly went unanswered was a drone strike 3 months in the making, or just assumed their luck had finally turned, isn't something the record shows. War rarely closes its own loops that neatly. Most of the men whose lives were shaped by that radar going dark never learned why. Intercepted Russian radio traffic, recovered by a Ukrainian signals unit, and later shared with the drone crew, captured the confusion directly. One transmission, roughly translated, complained that the group can't triangulate, coordinates are old, request alternate asset. A gunner on the other end of the line, discovering in real time that the ears his entire battery depended on simply weren't there anymore. 22 guns, 1 radar, a single vampire drone that cost, by the unit's own estimate, somewhere around $18,000 including the shape charge. Set that next to the $10 to $14 million radar it destroyed, and you get a cost-exchange ratio that looks almost absurd on paper. But the real number that matters isn't the price of the hardware. It's the 18 hours, where an entire Russian artillery group along the Kreminna axis couldn't answer Ukrainian fire, and Ukrainian crews finally got to shoot without running. Is that a fair trade for 3 months of patient watching, 2 failed attempts, and 1 near abort over a shift change routine? Depends whether you're counting the cost in dollars or in the artillery crews who didn't take counter-battery fire during that window. Replacing the antenna array took Russia closer to 5 weeks, according to later Ukrainian intelligence assessments, with a substitute Zoopark unit rotated in from a rear depot to cover the gap. That substitute never operated with the same confidence. Crews who'd learned their old radar's blind spots and timing now had to relearn a different unit's habits. on a front line that wasn't getting any quieter. The footage sat unreleased for weeks after the strike. Operational security, mostly. The unit didn't want Russian analysts studying their approach pattern or the shift change intelligence that made the final attempt possible. That's the answer to the open question from the start of this video. Why keep something this dramatic off the public feed for so long? Sometimes the most important strike of a campaign is also the one nobody hears about until the tactic itself stops being useful to protect. Would you have released this footage the week it happened, or sat on it for weeks the way this crew did, trading bragging rights for operational security? That's worth an answer in the comments. None of this ended the war in that sector. Russia rebuilt its counter-battery coverage. Ukrainian crews eventually went back to firing and moving, because a new radar means new risk. But for 18 hours in late May 2026, a single octocopter with a shaped charge did something that months of counter-battery fire, artillery duels, and infantry pressure hadn't managed. It blinded an entire artillery group and let the other side finally shoot straight. There's a piece of this we couldn't fully verify on camera, exactly how the captured signals log made its way to this specific unit, and whether it came from the same overrun position near Torska that Ukrainian sources have mentioned in passing elsewhere. If you've heard more about that operation, drop it in the comments. We read all of them. If you want to see how one 9-word radio call from a Mavic pilot saved a pinned recon team near Vovchansk, that story's on this channel too. And it starts with almost the same kind of patience this Kreminna crew showed. Watching, waiting, refusing to fire until the moment actually mattered. Subscribe if you want more of these stories pulled straight from footage crews don't usually let out. This is Drone Combat Files.